Hi, I'm Jeff Cagna, Executive Advisor for Foresight First LLC in Reston, Virginia. Welcome to this Asae Research Foundation virtual lounge conversation on two just released ForesightWorks action briefs on the surveillance economy and algorithms and rights. I'm joined by an outstanding panel of three experienced association professionals, and the four of us will discuss the implications of these action briefs for your association and its stakeholders. You can download these action briefs from the online interface. Association decision makers like you need research-based intelligence to prepare their organizations for the future. The Asae Research Foundation is meeting that need with Asae ForesightWorks. More than a trends program, Asae ForesightWorks provides insight from ongoing systematic environmental scanning to ensure that the association community is prepared for what's coming next. To learn more about the Asae Research Foundation's ForesightWorks initiative, please visit the link on the slide. In addition to the two action briefs we'll be discussing today, there are two additional new action briefs that have been released, one on China's world and one on beyond recycling. Before we begin our conversation, just a quick reminder about the unusual conditions under which we're operating. You're viewing this session on August 11th, but it was recorded weeks earlier, and in 2020, it's reasonable to suggest that the world may look quite different today than it did then. Please keep that in mind as we move through our conversation. Today's panelists and I will participate in the online chat to share additional perspectives and answer your questions. So with that opening for our session, I want to begin our conversation with the panel by turning to our first question, and I want to thank everyone on the panel. They're going to do self-introductions as part of their responses to this first question. And so we'll just jump right in with the first question. And in a moment, I'm going to pose this specifically to Bob London. But the opening question is, thinking about your review of the two action briefs, what do you think is most important for association decision makers to better understand about algorithms and surveillance technologies? And Bob, for you specifically, you're an executive director working with a board of directors. As you look at these action briefs, what do you see as the most important issues for your board to understand? Bob, are you with us? You may be on mute.
Hi, everyone. I'm the Chief Staff Officer of Alpha Phi Omega National Service Fraternity, a position I have held for the last 18 years. APO is a gender-inclusive, collegiate-based organization with about 25,000 students that develops its members through leadership development through serving others. First, to this question, I want to acknowledge that not all boards are equally sophisticated. So for my board, they need to understand that all data is not equal. There's a need to know what is behind the data, what is the bias in the data, is the data tainted? As we collect information that we are asking our members to give up, how much of their personal agency are we requesting? I think many of us have a love-hate relationship with data. In the surveillance economy driver, the first forecast speaks to the growth of online and real-world surveillance. We love the personalized shopping experience, but hate the repeated online ads we see afterwards. Our members are no different. They want a personalized experience with our association, but they don't want us intruding into their lives. So what is the balance of the data we collect in an inclusive manner?
So yeah, I think you're referring in your comments, Bob, to the forecast on page 1 of the Surveillance Economy Action Brief, talking about targeted advertising and systems for processing, smarter systems for processing data, and this growing infrastructure that's out there that provides cheap and aggregated personal data. So I think that is an important point for boards to understand. Let me turn to Damita Snow. And Damita, you're an experienced association professional and someone who has a clear understanding of artificial intelligence. What issues in these action briefs captured your attention that you see as most important?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Damita Snow. I'm the Senior Manager of Publishing Technologies at the American Society of Civil Engineers. I also chair our Staff Diversity and Inclusion Council. Jeff, I would say that in the Algorithms and Rights brief, There's a statement about the balance between societal concerns and convenience as it relates to AI and algorithms. For me, the most important issue here relates to people. You know, a few weeks ago, I saw someone controlling a Bobcat-like machine with a remote control, and I remember thinking, what happened to that worker? Did they lose their job, or was that person retrained in some way? So I think about the jobs that may be lost as automation increases. And also, I want to talk about convenience. How convenient and how convenient is AI really? You know, like everyone else, I want things to be as easy as possible. Personally, I would say that people get frustrated with Alexa and Siri, even though they are supposed to make our life easy. You know, my husband is from Alabama, and he gets frustrated with voice-enabled devices because they don't always understand his accent.
Mm-hmm.
So I would ask, who benefits the most from such machines? Who did the voice training? Did the person happen to come from the South? Are there, you know, and then there are those accessibility concerns. So I would say that algorithms must be all-inclusive, especially if you are or wish to be a global organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are real concerns about how much of a trade-off we're making for convenience. And Bob referenced earlier the idea of agency. We're somewhat trading off our desire for convenience with our giving up some of the agency that we have. And obviously there are lots of issues, and we're going to talk more about them as we move forward. So Reggie Henry, welcome, and thanks for being a part of the panel. I want to ask you specifically, you're a C-suite executive, have been for a long time. You're a technologist as well as people within ASA and the association community know well. What did you focus on as you reviewed these two action briefs that you think is important for association decision makers to understand?
So first of all, I want to agree with both of my co-panelists here. And Damita, I have that same problem with Siri. From time to time, I'm asking it questions and it's giving me answers, and I realize it did not understand what I said for whatever reason. But Jeff, to answer your question specifically, I think I thought about three things. One is what are the services and systems we have in place that have applications processes associated with them, and should we be at the point right now that we should be auditing all of those application processes and all of those systems for bias? And I went looking and I couldn't find any good bias auditing kind of procedures. So at some point in time, I might talk to you about that and see what you notice out there, or something we might develop. The other thing is, and I think both of the panelists referenced it as well, is how do we balance the growing demands for personalization with the information needs we have to provide that personalization to our members? You know, I had one of our members say to me directly when I was asking her, what kind of things could ASA do for you? And she said, I use all of your systems, you should know me. And that just stuck with me. And the third thing is what education does ASAE need to provide to our members to navigate these issues on an ongoing basis? This isn't just something for the here and now. These issues are changing as we speak, and so there needs to be some ongoing education in place to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And again, I think that's something we'll be talking about more going forward. And I would agree also with this. You know, certainly there's huge concerns about the bias within algorithmic systems within artificial intelligence enabled systems, and fairness issues, you know, especially when it comes to, for example, to something like hiring systems that are using AI. Are they in fact being used in a fair manner, being developed in a fair manner? There are, on the one hand, concerns about how the algorithms are developed and used. On the other hand, there's also the argument that says that these systems are actually more fair, less biased than human managers are. So it's finding the balance between those two things. I think one thing that struck me about looking at both of these briefs was that in July, there was an article in the New York Times that really hit home about the connection between these two ideas of the surveillance economy and algorithms and rights. And it was in the business section of the Sunday New York Times in mid-July. And the article detailed how in San Francisco, there is a growing privately funded surveillance camera network going up across the city. And it's being privately funded by a tech mogul, a wealthy guy who made his money in a tech company, but who is a San Francisco native and is very concerned about property crime. It's not really intended as a broad-based surveillance network. It's really focused on property crime, breaking into cars and stealing things, lots of theft across different parts of the city. And it's privately funded and controlled by local community groups. It does not involve the police. In fact, the police have really no relationship with this system, but the district attorney in San Francisco is working with this this tech mogul on trying to build out this system and giving local community control. And so on the one hand, they're building out this surveillance network, which of course is interesting in a city like San Francisco, which has one of the most stringent laws against facial recognition use by government entities in the city of San Francisco. It's essentially banned in San Francisco. So on the one hand, you see this need for surveillance to maintain issues around security, around property crime, but then you also have this issue of facial recognition being something that is regarded as a toxic technology in that city and really around the world, and lots of companies, even since the pandemic began and since the recent challenges with respect to George Floyd's murder and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, these concerns around facial recognition technology being biased against Black Americans, against other people of color, and ending research. IBM has ended its research into facial recognition technologies. Amazon has put a moratorium for 1 year on selling its facial recognition technologies to law enforcement. So there are lots of concerns around how these technologies are being used. And this article really did, I think, a good job of pointing out how both of these things are happening. The surveillance is growing, but then there's also these issues around how do we make sure that people's rights are not being violated in the process. So I don't know if anyone wanted to comment, on that before I move to the next question. If there's any additional thoughts anyone would like to share.
Yeah, what I would share, Jeff, is we sometimes see these issues and think they're not related to our work. And I think for all of us as associations, we have member organizations involved in all matters and sorts of things that might not look like association work, but in the end, they're all connected. And what I'm always mindful of is how these technologies that appear in society, in the consumer space or whatever space, eventually make their ways back into associations. And so I think all of these things are things we need to pay attention to on a professional level and also on a personal level.
Yes, I would agree. And I think that, and we'll talk more about this, I think, as our conversation continues. But I think that, one of the things that for me, associations should be thinking about is, will associations be on the right side of these conversations? I think that as access to surveillance technologies and algorithmic technologies grows and it becomes less expensive for anyone to use them, which is these are issues discussed in the action briefs, I think that there is a real danger that they will be used by all kinds of entities in ways that are actually violative of people's privacy, potentially, quite detrimental to the reputation of the association or of the organization if they were using it that way. I think there's some real questions about that we have to examine and tease out. So I don't know, Bob. Go ahead, Reggie.
Yeah, one example that I see that I have seen or have heard folks talk about and experiment with was having drones flying around exhibit halls as a way of doing lead gathering, for example. That might seem like a good idea on the surface, but good Lord, how many rights violations are inherent in just doing something like that, for example?
Yeah, definitely raises a lot of questions. Damita, Bob, any final thoughts on this question before we move to our next topic?
Well, just following up on those, I think it's also, it's not the intended use or not just the intended use, it's also how's the information going to be used down the road by somebody it wasn't created or intended for. I think that's exactly what we saw after 9/11 and government surveillance. And I think The same thing will permeate into the commercial markets as more and more of us have access to the surveillance economy.
Mm-hmm.
I would also add to Bob's point that that's true. What data are we collecting? How are we going to use it? Who is going to manage it? And where will it end up in the future? Is something that we all need to think about. Data management is a big thing, is a big deal. Privacy is yet another issue. And I know that you're going to talk about that a little bit later, Jeff, but absolutely, I agree with both of the panelists. We need to all be paying attention to what's happening in our volunteer organizations, in our associations, in our personal life, et cetera. It does all relate, as Reggie said.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, thank you all for your thoughts on the first question. Let me shift our focus now to a second question, which is, if I can just get that to move forward on my slide here. There we go. So our second question is over the next 36 months and beyond. So we want to sort of begin to put a time frame around this for our viewers. What do you see as the most significant human, ethical, and other implications of algorithms and surveillance technologies for associations, their current stakeholders, as well as their long-term successors? And we've started going down this pathway a little bit with our previous conversation, but let's get a little more specific. So Damita, I want to ask you the first question on this topic. So, and I want to get your reaction to something that is in the Algorithms and Rights Action Brief, and I'm going to quote it here directly. So quoting now, "The growing use of algorithms and automated systems will be a social and human rights issue, as their impacts will be correlated to class, gender, ethnicity, sometimes compounding existing social inequities." And as I said, we've started going down a little bit around this pathway, but I thought perhaps you could take a few moments and amplify and expand on what you see as the implications of that forecast for associations and their stakeholders.
Reggie mentioned something a few moments ago about a member who felt that the association should know her because they have so much information on her. And it's true. I believe that associations have access to more data now than they have ever before. And we all know that data drives decision making, or at least it should. So there's a responsibility in making sure that the data is accurate, that it represents the membership you serve now and the members you wish to serve in the future. For instance, in the Surveillance Economy Brief, it's mentioned that associations should question their vendors as to how the vendors operate. How are they collecting data? How are they vetting the data? And are they following your association's policies and practices? Regarding surveillance technologies, I once read that surveillance and power have long been closely linked to institutional racism. And most of the people that are stripped of their privacy are the ones that are the most vulnerable. So surveillance keeps the vulnerable vulnerable. If you own data, you have power. You get to be the one to decide who has access to what based on that particular data set. And there are questions associations might want to ask, such as, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, do we need this data? If we collect this data, where might it end up? And who could it harm?
It's really interesting you bring that up, Damita, because I remember reading a few years ago an article by a tech company person, not a big company, but actually a company in Scandinavia. It might have been Sweden, if I recall correctly, in which he said, we always think of data as an asset, which I certainly agree it is an asset, but it's also a liability for exactly the reason that you're describing, right? The more data that an organization owns, the more susceptible it perhaps becomes to a serious breach of that data. That becomes a legal, reputational, financial risk for them. But then also, the longer the data is held, the more unhelpful it becomes, because longer-term data might be useful in some ways, but it's not really, if it's captured specifically, for example, with a marketing intention, the longer that data is held, it may not actually be as fresh and as useful. So there are liabilities associated with all this data collection that's going on, just as much as there are assets to it. And one of the things you said about decision making that I would just sort of mildly push back on is I agree that we need to use data in our decision making, but I always sort of push back on the idea that we want to make our decisions data driven, because I think, to me, that somehow indicates that the data is the only factor in the decision, that it really should be data infused. We want to put data into the decision, but that the decision should be human. And that really does become an issue when you're talking about something like artificial intelligence, because if we're relying upon the data to use algorithms to train algorithms to then come to predictions that are often used as decisions, then where that data comes from, as you and others have said, and how good that data is, becomes a real factor in whether decisions are based on good information or whether they're actually based on biased or flawed information. So I think there's some interesting nuances to this that I think we have to tease out. It's an important thing for us to be thinking through, and I think now we're all dealing with so many questions. How do we tease through? We said tease out these issues and think about them in a productive and generative fashion. There's one other point here that I want to make sure we don't miss, and then I'm going to come to Reggie for a comment about another part of the action brief, which is I don't think that we should ignore what's going on in China right now with artificial intelligence. That relates very much to these issues of surveillance and algorithms and rights. The Chinese government, the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, has committed itself to a national goal of becoming the AI global leader by the end of this decade, by 2030. And they are very much serious about moving forward on that, despite what's gone on with the pandemic. They are moving forward. They see it as a pathway to global geopolitical dominance, to economic dominance. And yet, their approach to artificial intelligence, to algorithms and rights, to surveillance. They were very aggressive, for example, in surveillance in the early days of the pandemic, at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, in terms of figuring out, who was infected and ways that were quite violative of human rights. And so there are issues there. And the reason why I think it's important for everyone who's watching this to understand this is that China's influence has been growing over the last many months around the world. They have been on a sort of whirlwind diplomacy effort and an economic tour, in a sense, helping other countries as they move through the pandemic. And so their influence is growing. If their approach, their view of artificial intelligence gains traction around the world, that's something that would, I think, be very negative for privacy rights, for human rights around technology. And it's something that we don't want to ignore. And that is referenced in these action briefs. And also, I think it's touched upon in the China's World action brief that I mentioned earlier, is also coming out now from Asae ForesightWorks. So Reggie, let me turn to you with another question about a forecast in the algorithms and rights briefs, or actually a couple of take action items, and I want to just reference, and I think you touched on them earlier, but maybe we can go a little bit further, because there are a couple of items within that brief that it suggests for associations to take: to acknowledge, first of all, the algorithms you're using today, and to protect members from biased and harmful algorithms. So as a technologist, as I said earlier, but also someone who's responsible for member relationships and engagement, what do you see as the implications of those take action items of acknowledging algorithms being used today and protecting members from biased and harmful algorithms?
Yeah, a couple of things, Jeff. One is there's a massive amount of education that technology staffs need to undertake right now to understand not only the implications for their internal systems, but most of us have a whole slew of technology partners. And right now, I need to make sure I understand, if I'm using an AI-infused email platform, for example, I need to understand how they're making decisions about who gets what. If I'm starting to think about, all of the policies we have in place for when we do not release any of our members' information to anybody for any reason other than what they intended to be. We've got GDPR and PCI compliance and the California Data Protection Act. We've got all these things that are kind of guideposts for us. I don't know that all of us have internalized those in the way we need to. So there's some education around that. The second thing is, Jeff, most associations I know are at least considering or somewhere along the path of data transformation or systems transformation. And so now is the time to think about the viewpoint of your system. So for example, if your system is designed to sell people things that you have versus give them what they need, then your systems do different things. If your system is designed to sell, then you're trying to maximize however you have to getting rid of your product. If your system is designed around member needs and what they need, it can, I think, achieve personalization at the same time as it reduces the amount of information you need. So there's different applications for systems, I think, in there, and that's the shift I think we have to make, is that shift from a product-based relationship with our members to a needs-based relationship to our members, and I think some of these things start to answer themselves.
I think that's right, and I would add in one other thought, which is, especially on this point of protecting members from biased and harmful algorithms. I think that actually associations, I said earlier about being on the right side of these issues. I think that one thing associations should really consider, in terms of implications here, is directing their advocacy efforts toward ensuring that algorithms are not biased and harmful. Whether it's advocacy on a public policy level, you mentioned some of the laws that have been enacted around the world and around the United States, and there are other cities and states that are enacting other legislation to do this, because there's not a federal law on this yet in the United States. There's some protections for email, but there isn't something quite as stringent with respect to AI, and no regulation of that kind. And so, but there are things happening at other levels. So associations using their advocacy tools to advocate on behalf of their stakeholders, to say, we want to protect you from biased and harmful algorithms, even if that has to happen at the state capitol versus the federal level, and perhaps eventually that will be something that will be done at the federal level as well. So let me turn now to Bob for a comment on a forecast in the surveillance economy action brief, and I'm going to quote this now directly. Surveillance will continue to democratize. Technologies that provide affordable, pinpoint intelligence are proliferating and will make surveillance accessible to smaller organizations and even individuals. So, Bob, what impact do you think this forecast could have on how stakeholders interact with their associations, and how should association CEOs like you and the boards you work with think about these issues?
So I think the way we really need to start thinking about them is taking transparency as a buzzword and making it a value. If we're not completely transparent in the surveillance economy, especially as it becomes more and more accessible, as the driver of change says, we have to be transparent in how we're collecting the information and data, how are we using that information, and to what Damita said, do we need the data, right? How many times have we heard a board say, oh, that would be interesting to know, and next thing you know, staff is out there, going through some project because a board member was curious about something. There's going to have to be more meaning behind those things. Our information and data gathering has to be purposeful and benefit our stakeholders. And we're going to need tools that we don't have now. To what Reggie was talking about, in a smaller organization, 15 staff members like I have, I don't even know the right questions to ask some of our technology partners to make sure that I am pulling out the biases, whether it's exhibit space, connection, monitoring beacons, those types of things, or whether it's even much more advanced than that. So there's this real void of tools that we're going to need, and we're going to need help in other, like Asae and others, to help us navigate these as we try and be as transparent and purposeful as possible with all of our data, whether it's surveillance or algorithms.
Yeah, it's such a great point, and I think it really brings together things that all of you have said, which is, and we're going to get into a third question about decisions that associations should make in a second, but I think I'll just comment here because you brought it up, Bob, which is making sure that in order to make the decisions we're going to talk about, that decision makers like you, CEOs and boards, know what questions to ask, right? And know how do you get to understanding how algorithms have been developed, who developed them, where are they coming from, were the developers diverse? You know, there's such a huge issue in the AI space around the lack of Black developers, other people of color, women. It's mostly a white male field, and so there is a great challenge there, a great problem with those developers not understanding how the things that they're developing, making assumptions and building in biases that will negatively affect those communities. And so how do the tech companies that are using these tools, are they developing them internally? Are they working with partners? What's the diversity of those developers? How do they take into consideration issues of bias with training data and making sure that they are not embedding human bias into the systems even as they develop them? There's so many issues like that decision makers, not just CIOs and CTOs, but other C-suite executives and boards and CEOs, of course, need to understand to be able to have these conversations at a governance level as well as at an operational level for the organization. Reggie, Damita, did you want to comment on anything you've heard before we shift to the final question?
Yeah, the thing I would add to it, Jeff, is that there's going to need to be a shift in resources for us to be able to do these things, right? It costs a fair amount of money to do things right now. When they acknowledge that there will have to be some amount of your budget that you shift towards auditing your systems for bias. There'll be a certain amount of money resources that you'll have to put toward ensuring that your vendor partners are complying with the same values and policies that you have. So I don't want people to think that this is free. or that it is just something you snap your fingers and get done, because it won't be. One thing I'll say, Jeff, is I'm going to take some of this back to our technology advisory council and have us look into what kind of tool can we help develop that will help organizations, especially small staff organizations, through this process in terms of a systems bias audit and those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There is one other thing I do want to add, and Bob alluded to this, is that we must acknowledge what we don't know. We must reach out to our partners, new partners, and also figure out the questions that we do need to ask in order to handle business in different ways. You know, in the current state of affairs, the way that we're living at this point, you know, remotely, we reach out to our members remotely, we reach out to our staff remotely. We're doing things in a different way, and we need to figure out how best to use the information that we have in the future and right now, and how to reach out and get new information, new data, what are the new ways to collect data, and again, acknowledge what we don't know.
Mm-hmm. It's so true, and what I hear implied, you know, in your comment there, Damita, I think it's been present in our conversation. So I want to make it explicit because I don't think anyone has actually said this word yet. It really comes down to trust, right? Who do we trust? Do we trust, you know, the creators of the technology, the partners we're working with? Do our stakeholders trust the association to get this right? You know, do we trust ourselves, you know, in terms of what you said, Damita, we don't know what we don't know. Do we trust ourselves to be able to get to a place where we have sufficient understanding to be able to take action in a way that we know will not be detrimental to our stakeholders? And I think that is one of the challenges with technologies like these that are AI enabled and so appealing in a sense of, you know, being able to, as Reggie said, and, you know, others have alluded to, this idea of being able to use surveillance in creative ways to capture information and capture, you know, create excitement potentially in different ways, using AI for convenience and so on and so forth, that there's such an appeal to that idea that our systems can be smarter, and I think they should be smarter, but it can't be done in a way that is does not respect the fact that individual rights and that organizational reputation and other very key issues are on the line in the way these technologies are used. And I've said consistently for a long time now, I don't think we have fully learned the lessons of the downsides that have occurred with both social and mobile, right? We got very excited for a long time about social technologies. Now we're seeing some of those downsides. We got very excited about mobile technologies, and both of those choices to be excited were appropriate at the time, but we did not do enough to really grasp the downsides of those technology platforms, and now we're seeing them more fully. We are very clear-eyed, or should be, about the downsides around the technologies described in these two action briefs, and it's incumbent upon decision makers to be serious about dealing with those downsides up front before we get too excited about how these technologies get fully invested, fully implemented into our existing technology platforms, as well as using them in new and creative ways. So really great discussion. I want to thank you all for your points on that question, which really brings us to our final question here. And I'm going to pose the same question that's on the slide here to all of our panelists, which is, based on the conversation that we've had, I really want to make this about our viewers to get them to one important decision. So based on the conversation that we've had, what is the most important decision that associations need to make in the next 12 months with respect to algorithms and surveillance technologies? And Reggie, I'd like to start with you on that.
Jesus, Jeff, you asked me to make one decision about something we've been talking about for half an hour. I think the most important decision they can make right now is to educate themselves about these issues and the implications of these issues.
Okay. All right. Bob, what do you think?
Bob, I think you're on mute, sir.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
After 5 months, I'll try and figure, turning that mute off. My apologies. So
no apologies required.
Right. The one thing that most of us, especially mid and smaller size associations, have to do, we have to commit to having the conversation. We have to have it now. There's so many of my colleagues that I know that this is so far off their radar. They don't have the bandwidth to do that. But it's so important that we start this yesterday, and I'm super happy to hear what Reggie was saying with the technology committee, because we need to audit our own processes right now, and we have no idea how to go ahead and do that. Just by example, from using this or being aware of the driver of change on algorithm and rights, we stopped using award judging software for some of the awards we hand out because it seems fine to us, but we don't know what the biases are behind that. And so until we can figure those out, even though we think it was an okay tool, we stopped using it, went back to human-only process until we can learn from that vendor exactly what's behind that software. So I think the important thing is having that conversation now is where a lot of groups need to start.
Damita, before you go, I just really want to acknowledge Bob for sharing that story, because I think that's a really important thing you just said, that your organization stopped using a technology tool because you did not feel comfortable that you had sufficient understanding of how that algorithm was working, and that it might actually have bias in it, which might put some candidates for awards at a disadvantage. And you need to understand that better, and are using human reviewers versus using that algorithm. And I think that's so important, because there are very few organizations that I think willingly, sometimes they'll do it under pressure, but they don't usually willingly make the decision to step back and do something different until they have more information. So I just really want to acknowledge you and your organization for doing that, because it's such a rare thing. And I think it's an important thing for those of you who are watching this to think about as you look at the algorithms that you're using. Is there something there that gives you pause? And perhaps you would follow the example that Bob has just given us. So thank you for sharing that, Bob. I'm sorry, Damita, go ahead with what you wanted to share.
That's fine. Like Reggie, I had a few things in response to that question, but if I had to choose one, I would go with review your data collection methods and review your data management policy often. I would say use tools that improve D&I in your diversity and inclusion in your data. I think that the policies that we currently have in place, as I mentioned before, as it relates to data management need to be reviewed, considering the way that we are now doing business. Also, I would bring, and Jeff, you alluded to this, have a diverse group in those developer meetings. Diverse meaning, as it relates to gender, race, ethnicity, etc. So in summary, I would just say that please review your data management policies. What do they look like? And remember to go back and review them often.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point as well, that, and I think that, the organizations need to have that more expansive view of those data management policies, because I think probably on some very operational level, there's some review that's going on, but to what you're speaking to is that broader sense of how are the data management policies potentially, perhaps, unintentionally though, but still somehow having a negative effect on people of color, on Black people, on people of other groups, trying to figure out ways to make sure that those policies are consistent with organizational commitments to diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and making sure that technologies are not being used either in an unintentional way or worse, in an intentional way to discriminate, to advance, to promulgate racism. That's not acceptable. It's never been acceptable, but it's certainly not acceptable today. It needs to be addressed. And unfortunately, those biases and those unintended consequences are hiding in a lot of infrastructure that's been built up over many decades that really needs to be examined very closely. So I think that's a very important point. For me, the decision is for all associations to proceed with care in the way that they are approaching the use of these technologies. And I think that message has probably come through in this conversation, not just from me, but also from our other panelists, which is to proceed with care and for as long as possible to keep humans in the loop on even the simplest ways of using technology, whether it's for surveillance, whether it's algorithms to make systems smarter, whether it's for automation, to keep humans in the loop, to make sure that humans are observing carefully what's going on so that there aren't unintended consequences, so that there aren't situations where poor data sets, biased data sets have trained algorithms in ways that actually integrate human bias into the technology. So proceeding with care, exercising considerable care at the governing level, at the staff decision-making level, at the senior level, at the operational level, making sure that humans are always participating. And as Damita said, a diverse group of humans participating, and not just diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, and so on, but looking at a diversity of fields, right? So not just technologists who are doing this work, but also people coming from other fields, because people who work in technology see things through a technology lens, and that's very useful, but we want to complement that with lenses that other people have, the membership lens or the stakeholder relationship lens, the external lens, the publications, education, and so on. We want to have a different set of eyes and thoughts on this. So a more comprehensive view of things, I think, is important. So making that decision to be as inclusive as possible and keeping humans involved in the loop until there is a comfort level that technologies can operate in a way where they are not discriminating and they are not violating privacy and all the considerations that we've been talking about during our session. So I want to close things out by giving each of our panelists an opportunity to make a closing comment before I wrap things up. So we'll go back through our panel again in the same order that we just did. So Reggie, I want to open the floor to you for a closing comment.
Yeah, I think these issues are complicated, but I think that they stem from the actual missions of organizations. I really do. Again, and what's in the back of my mind, the sum of somebody's data is not who they are. The sum of somebody's data is not what they need from the organization. So I think if your approach to how you're servicing your members has a lot to do with this. I think the associations will be judged on how they deal with this issue. You know, the relationship that we have with our members is different than the relationship Amazon has with its customers or GM has with its customers. It's more intimate, and our members expect us to be more intentional about things like their privacy and security.
Thank you, Reggie, and thank you for all your contributions to our conversation today. Bob? You may be on mute.
He actually may be gone. I don't see him at the bottom of the screen anymore.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Say he did to leave early.
Okay, so Damita?
I would say that our members expect a lot from organizations, from the organizations that they belong to, and we owe it to them to make the best decisions that we can based on the information that we have. And you're right, Jeff, you did mention that there must be human decision making involved as well. I don't disagree with that. So I think that we need to go back to review the data that we have and keep in mind privacy concerns and make sure that we have policies and procedures in place to make the best decisions that we can based on the information that we have.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Ask questions.
So no, I couldn't agree more. I was going to say, and I really want to thank you, Damita, for being a part of our conversation. Thank you for your perspectives and contributions to this conversation. You've really added a lot to the discussion. Bob, I don't know if you've rejoined us. Maybe you dropped off. I can't actually see from my screen right now whether you're there. Okay, well, he may be having some tech difficulty, so I apologize that we may have lost Bob's closing comment for us, but I want to thank him as well for his participation in this session. So my closing comment is actually two comments. First, association decision makers must recognize today that the topics we've been discussing in this conversation, the impact of algorithms on human rights, the implementation of artificial intelligence and automation, the acceptance of facial recognition and surveillance, will be among the defining and most difficult issues we will need to address in the next decade and beyond. It's absolutely critical for boards, CEOs, and other decision makers to understand how these technologies are being used now and will continue to be used in the years ahead, as well as the serious and potentially devastating implications they could have for our society and for our stakeholders going forward. And you heard that in all of our panelists' comments today. Second, what you've been watching was an intentional foresight conversation designed specifically for learning and oriented toward the future rather than grounded primarily in present-day concerns. It is our sincere hope that your takeaways from this session are not only related to the substance of the critical issues we've discussed, but also to the practices that you can adopt to build your personal capacity for foresight, as well as the capacity of your board, staff, and other decision makers in your association. As we conclude this session, let me express my sincere gratitude to Bob London, Damita Snow, and Reggie Henry for an extremely rich and thought-provoking conversation. You are invited to follow up with any questions using the contact information that you see on the screen. My thanks also to Emily Rabbit, Keith Skillman, and Garrett Turner of Asae for their efforts in organizing this session. And finally, thank you for participating in this session today. On behalf of all of my colleagues, I hope you found value in this exploration of the surveillance economy and algorithms and rights ForesightWorks action briefs. And I hope you will participate in other Asae Research Foundation virtual lounge conversations. For now, please enjoy the rest of virtual Asae 20 and please stay safe and well. Good afternoon.